So, hey, I'm Russell. I'm a front-end engineer at Archimedes, and today I'm going to be talking about forms in React, right? And specifically using forms with Formik in React, right? Okay, so let's just get started. So, there's obviously a couple of issues you have with forms in React. Number one is if you check the documentation on the React website, it's a little hard to decipher how to use forms with certain things, etc. Right? So the documentation isn't as detailed, and if you're running through this the first time, at least for me, I found it a little confusing, right? And as you write forms, it kind of becomes a big issue if you have a large application because nowadays I mean, applications essentially what let's say like a large percent of it is definitely forms, and you dealing with forms in a clean and efficient way really helps the whole experience from a UI perspective, UX as well as a DX perspective, right? So it's a very important thing, right? And a couple of things are very apparent when you start writing forms. Number one, you want them to scale without like having an infinite number of lines of code in every component, etc., right? And validation, instead of figuring out your own regex, etc., right? So it's always good to have a standard library, etc., like can handle all of your stuff. And error handling is extremely important, right? Telling your user, hey, this is not an email, like the length of this password is too less, just saying this is a required field, etc. So error handling is an extremely important aspect of a form. And lastly, if your application is, let's say, mid to large scale, you definitely need to look at make writing components that are extremely reusable, and it will be very efficient in order to scale it as fast as possible, and just like have cleaner code in general, right? So first, what we're going to do is let's dive into the code, and we're going to look at two examples, right? Number one, we look at a normal form, which is just written in plain React. And then the next thing, we'll go ahead and write the same thing in Formik, and we'll start implementing a few more interesting things in Formik, which will give us a wholesome app, let's say, right? So cool. So let me just first give you guys like what is explain to you what Formik is. So Formik is a super cool library built by Jared Palmer, and it helps streamline building forms, and it's super cool. It ties up with something called Yup. Yup is a schema validation library. So it Formik is built in a way that it ties up with Yup really well, right? So these two things they work hand in hand, and they just work flawlessly. So I'll paste these links in the chat so you guys can check this out, but let me just close them for right now. So let's just dive into the code. Right. So a few things to keep in mind. Number one, I'm using Ant Design for my UI library over here, as well as I've already created a couple of custom styles, etc. And I'm using this. So this is plain React. There's no other library being used for the form, etc. Right. So let's just jump into how it looks here. Right. So this is a super simple form, as you can see, and I'm printing out a few things which are stuck in state. This is regarding email, this is your password, and this is just an is logged in boolean. So let's just jump into how this is written, and then we'll see how we can improve upon this, as well as how Formik and Yup is are just going to make our life way easier. Right, so cool. Firstly, we're looking at our state. So we have email, password, and is logged in. So let's not worry about is logged in right now. Let's focus on email. So the way this works is um, the initial state of something, no one has touched any one of these fields. So when I'm referring to a field, I'm only referring to the email field right now, right? So we need to handle a few things, right? So when a user clicks on this itself, right, and they even like use it, for example, right? So we need to keep track of all these things, and we need to also keep track of the error, etc., right? So this is when it gets a little cumbersome. So the way I did it here is I passed an object here. One of the keys is the value itself, and another one is error, and then we also know if it's touched or not, right? And the second thing we have is password. Passwords, like, let's not complicate this with this logic again. So it's just a simple string which holds your password, right? So let's just jump into the JSX. So the first three pre-tags are just rendering these out in this top section, so we can ignore this completely for right now. But let's just look into how this works, right? So I'm getting an input component from ant. I'm passing it email dot value because email is an object that contains a key called value. I'm passing it an on change and placeholder, etc. Right. So let's just jump into the on change. So what's happening here is I'm setting the state, with I'm spreading out email first and then changing the stuff that's required. So for my validation, I'm using a custom JS, regex over here, right? So this is where it gets a little tough. You'll have to like find this or write this yourself. So it can get cumbersome, right? So I'm doing a validation which is custom every time, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is each on-chain itself will differ per input field, if you will, but then more or less they are the same, right? They handle a few things. They take the state, they take the value and then set it in the state, and then like, so that's a control component basically in React, right? And the second thing at the bottom you see here is I'm checking, there's a condition here, and then I'm saying, hey, this is not a valid email, and we show that. And let's jump to the password section, right? So I'm getting this password component from input, which is coming from ant design. And the same thing's happening there as well. I'm passing in the value, and there is a handle change here, which is basically set password, and that's setting it to state. So then finally the button is going to submit it, and let's just see what happens on submit, which is on the form. So we're going to prevent default, we're going to set is logged in to true. Over here basically you will add your own custom logic to like an async call, obviously that's going to verify the user, etc. But since we're not doing that here, let's just assume this is it, and we're going to set the emails to we're going to reset these fields. So basically that's what's happening. So let me just show you this, for example. So let me just type in this, and you see this is all true, so there's no issues. And let me go ahead and type in some password, and you see the passwords here, and then I can hit login, and there we go. So we're logged in, and now we can just hit logout, and that should be fine, right? So this field didn't reset, I didn't have that. Okay, so let's go ahead and just check if what happens if we type a wrong email, right? So let's just say test and we click out. Oh man, I didn't tag that in. But anyways, so you see these fields are basically checking for all of, one sec, someone's joining. Okay. So these fields are basically checking for all of these errors, etc. And we have to manually go ahead and add all these things, and it just becomes a little cumbersome for someone to keep track of and like manage all these things. So what another thing I've done, for example, is I've disabled it based on what these things are, like if these fields are filled, etc. Right? So it's a little cumbersome, as you can see. We have different states for each and every uh, field, if you will, right? Or it can also be a select, a checkbox, etc. And then we have to have like one, obviously handle submit. That's completely fine, but we might have multiple on change for each of these individual fields, which can become a little bit tough to keep track of. And obviously validation is going to be a big pain for all of them, right? And that's something we definitely do not want. So this is how forms are more or less written in React. So let's just jump into how Formik works, and let's go ahead and make this process a little easier, right? So let me firstly jump into the index and uncomment this, right? So let's just go to this component. Let's close the rest of them. So what's happening now is you'll see all we're rendering out is basically just a simple card that just returns Formik, right? So that's over here. So Formik itself requires a few things. You can use the hooks, but I'm just going to use a plain React component. So let's go ahead and start importing stuff first, and then I'll explain how we're going to use it, right? So let's go to Formik and let's pull out a few things. So first thing we're going to need is the form itself. Let me get to the form. I'll explain what these do in some time. Let me just hide this. Yeah, Zoom stuff. Okay, cool. So we're also going to pull in something called Formik. Remember, these are React components. Then we are going to pull in something called error message, which we'll use in some time. And then finally, we're going to take something called Formik helper. So since I'm using TypeScript, I'm going to need this. I'll show you where, right? So let me also import yup for my validation. Oh God, what the hell just happened? I just missed an answer. Okay, cool. So we imported our stuff, and now let's just go ahead and start writing this. So Formic requires three main props, if you will. So the first thing is initial values. The second thing would definitely be, let's just say on submit for right now, right? And finally, we are going to be passing it validation schema, right? So let's just keep it there for right now. So let's go ahead and start implementing Formic. So let's type Formic. Let's ignore these for right now and let's close this out. And okay, so let's go ahead and start creating all these things. So remember, it was a login component. So let's just assume we have two right now. So let's go create an object called values. Is an object that has email, which is an empty string. The initial state of this is an empty string, and then we have password that is also an empty string. Right. So now we can feed this into a prop called initial values, which Formix going to consume. And now let's go ahead and write the on submit, right? So let's say const on submit. This can be an async function, but since this is not an async function where there's no call happening, I'm just going to write like a plain function, right? Um, okay. So we can pass this into on submit. So on submit is going to pass a few things as arguments into this function over here. So namely, there are two things here. So this you get the values, and you will get something a huge object called actions. Right. So let's go ahead and see what that is. But since we're using TypeScript, let's go ahead and create a few types first. Right. So let's just say type formic um, values is an object that has email, which is obviously a string, and it has password, which is a string. So you see initial values is this, right? So we know that the values are not going to be anything else except this unless we add another field here, but that's not going to happen right now, right? So let's assume it's only these two. So let's go ahead and set this to formic values, so we know exactly what this is. So now we have autocorrect. Like if we log this, we'll have values dot etc. So now actions is something we receive from formic. These are more utility based functions which we'll get to in this, but let's just set types for them right now. So we'll have to use the formic helpers type I've received here, and it receives a generic. We can pass this exact same generic, so it knows which types exist on the initial values, right? So let me quickly show you what actions contains now. So you'll see it has a reset form, just like these a ton of these uh, utility functions, but we're not going to be using them right now. So let's just leave that as is, right? Okay, cool. So now that we passed that in, now let's go ahead and write our form, right? So we finish initial values and on submit, we'll get to the validation schema in a little bit, right? So let's go ahead. And so we need to pass a form, but since we are using Formic, we might as well pick up the form they are giving us from their library itself. So this will inject any other props you need or whatever, right? So you don't need to manually do that. So let's just quickly pick up um, 1 second. Yep, someone's joined. Okay, so let's just quickly pick up form, and now let's go ahead and start typing out the inputs itself. So let's remember we are using input from here, which that's and. So let's just say input, right? Actually, we'll have to remove this. My bad. So first thing is we'll have to we'll receive a few things through render prop here. So I'm going to use it like this, right? So let's go ahead and pass a function here, and over here is where you can render out your stuff, right? So my bad. So let's go ahead and make this a control component, right? So let's pass the value. Let's assume we're going to pass it. Just let's leave it for right now. We'll pass a name. As of right now, let's leave it blank. We need to pass it an on change, and we also needed to pass an on blur, right? Let's also pass a placeholder. Let's actually say please enter email, right? Cool. So where are we going to be receiving these values? So we already know the value is an initial value, so we are not going to be doing like a initial value dot email. No, that would be the wrong approach here. We are going to be picking this directly from Formik, because Formik is going to do something with it and pass it to us, right? So where do we receive values from? So if you destructure out the arguments here, you can get values. So since we already, the Formix written in TypeScript, so it knows the type. So if we say values dot, we get the two um, keys over here that are basically corresponding to these. So let's just say email for right now. And the name property is something really important in Formic. It always has to match the exact key name which is in your initial values. Right? That's how Formic ties everything together behind the scenes. Cool. So let's go ahead and pass on change and on blur. So we can go ahead and destructure out a few more things from here. So let's just say handle change, and let's say handle blur. So we can pass them through handle change and handle blur, right? So there we go. We have this really simple thing hooked up. So let's just go ahead and print it out. Let's just print values. So we'll see what's being saved, right? So let's jump here. So we see the initial values, like we said, are empty strings. So if we start typing something, it starts getting saved. So it's already hooked up, right? That's great. So now let's just go ahead and copy the same thing and make the email part of it. I mean, the password part of it. So we'll be using password from input, which is coming from Formik. So we'll just replace the name, and we'll have to say dot password. Let's call this password. Remember, this has to match the exact key name and initial values, and password. So now if we jump back here, we'll see these fields. So let's quickly add just a bit of styling to them, right? So let's go say size is large, and we have last name, I think, styles dot margin. So it's just basically like a margin bottom. That's going to show here. Yes. Right, so these two things already there, and if you see, if I start typing, my password is hooked up and this is hooked up. Great, so we have these two things. Now let's add some validation to this, right? So we're going to be using yup for the validation. So let's go ahead and create the validation schema. Okay, so since we're going to be using yup, let's go ahead and say yup dot object, since this is going to be an object, and let's pass in the object over here. So again, these have to be the exact same key names. So let's say email first. So now we're going to tell yup that this is a string, right? And this is an email, and this is also required, right? So let's go ahead and do the same for password. So let's say yup dot string, and this is required since we don't need to pass anything else. Now, in each of these arguments, you can pass a string, and this string will be displayed when an error happens, right? So if it is not an email, let's just say please enter a valid email, right? And for required, let's go ahead and just say required, right? So it doesn't show anything else. Otherwise, Formik can yup show default text, but if you want to override the error messages, you can just pass it in here, right? So we can also say we want a minimum character length, but I'm not going to add that right now because it's just like a quick demo. So we need to pass the validation schema itself over here to a prop call validation schema, and we just need to pass this through, and that should hook it up automatically, right? But now how do we get access to this, right? You can obviously go ahead and destructure a few more things out of this, like errors, etc. But let's not, like worry about that. We'll use something called error message, which is a React component that Formik provides, and we'll try to render out the whole error itself, right? So firstly, let's jump back here, and there's nothing that's going to render, right? But there's actually errors happening in the background because we haven't really shown those errors. So let's go ahead and do that. So firstly, let me wrap this in a div, and let me move this class name up here. Okay, so let's go ahead and say error message, and error message will receive a name. Again, this name is very important because it's tied to the initial values, and Formik knows what to pick where, right? So this also receives a render prop, but you can pass it this way. You will receive error message, which is obviously going to be a string, and then you can just return a p tag and just say error message. So remember, this error message is going to be the one that we passed over here, right? So let's just take a look at that. So by default, this is not going to show because there's no error, but you will see as we, there you go, as we, the moment we click in and click out, it knows it's a required field. So it's telling us this. So let's just go ahead and type in something wrong. Now it says, please enter a valid email. Now I can be like google.com. There you go. The error is gone completely. Right. So now let's just copy this component and add the same thing for password. So all we'll have to change here is password, right? So now we can check. Actually, no, yeah, there you go. That's much better. So let me just also wrap this in a div, so it'll be easier. Otherwise, the styles get off a little bit. Yeah, cool. So now you'll see the errors. If I type something, is completely fine, but then the moment I go back and I click out, it says required. Right. So you can style this text as you prefer over here itself, and that should do it. So now let's go ahead and figure out the submission part of the whole thing. So let's start with adding a button. So your button obviously has to be within the form. Actually, let's just pick up the button from, let me just close this zoom thing. Yes, so let's just pick up the button logic from the previous screen. Okay, so let's close this out. Okay, so let's just remove disable because we don't need that right now. And we have login, etc. Everything works. So the most important thing to pass here is obviously HTML type. You have to tell it that this is a submit button within the form. So the moment you pass it that, you will Formik knows what to do, right? So now on submits being called, and on submits obviously being passed at a Formik level, not a form level. And all on submit does right now is just log the values, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let's just clear this. Let's just say, you know, test whatever, and then hit login, and there you go. So you're receiving the values that are being passed here, right? So, and now you can do anything you want with these values, for example, make a call, etc. Right? So now Formik definitely provides a few more interesting utilities rather. So let's just go ahead and start using them, right? So let me jump to where I've destructured values from, and I'm going to pick two things from here. I'm going to pick something called is valid and dirty, right? So these will tell us the current state of our like errors, etc. These are just boolean values. So I know there's a prop called disabled on this button here, so let me just use it's valid and dirty. So what's going to happen now is, only so the button's going to be disabled, and only if things are fine, like there's no errors, etc., will it be enabled. So you see this. So if even if I type, for example, a valid email, it's fine, right? But I need to also pass a valid password, at least a single character in our case, right? So if I just pass one character, now we're allowed to go ahead and say login, right? So that's great. That kind of helps make sure our user doesn't really send half the data across and have errors. So let's go ahead and also improve our UI and show them a loader, right? So we can use so Formik has something called submitting, a submitting state, which is a boolean, and you can initially it will be set to false, and you can trigger it in your on submit using the actions to either true or false based on what happens in your calls. So let's go ahead again and pick out set, I mean sorry, is submitting, which is going to be a boolean. And so antdesign provides a prop called loading, which just receives a boolean again, and based on that it'll either show you a loader or it won't show you a loader, right? So we just need to pass is submitting over here. So initially this is false, and if we set this to true, this will be enabled, right? So let's just go ahead and try to mimic that. So what we'll do is, let's delete this, let's add a set timeout, since we are not going to be making an async call, right? So let's just say this takes about 500 milliseconds. And what we're going to do now is, the first thing is actions dot set submitting. So we're going to tell Formik that yes, this is true. So I am setting submission to true. And actually, no, we need to do this outside, my bad. And then 5 seconds later, I mean 500 milliseconds later, we're going to set this to false. So this makes sure we will see a loader, right? So let's just see how that looks. So let me just drop this down a bit. Yeah. So I'm going to add an email, and I'm going to add a password, and I'm going to hit that. There you go. You just see for 500. Actually, let me increase that to maybe a second long, so you'll be able to see it properly. And There you go. Right. So you're able to see what happens when we have an async call, for example, right? So these things, Formik helps us set the submitting states, etc., through on submit itself. So now let's just go ahead and hook up the is logged in function over here, right? So we what we'll do is we'll assume this call always happens since this is not async, and we will go ahead and set this state, set this to true. And another thing we need to do is we don't really, once we submit this, we need to reset this, right? So we don't want these fields to be populated anymore, right? So let's use another utility function called reset form, and we will go ahead, actually let's pass that, yeah, let's just keep it here, right? So we'll use it over here. So what's going to happen is after it sets submitting to false, then it's going to reset the form, and then it's going to set the um, state of is logged in to true. So let's just handle what happens over here, right? So let me actually cut out this whole section. We'll say not is logged in. Let's add a quick, no, let's, we need to add a fragment here, and then we will, again, we'll just jump back to the old code and we'll just pick up the logout button logic that is here. All this is going to do is on click is going to set the is logged in state to false. So let's just see how that works over here. So let's type something, hit login, and bam, we've logged in now. And the moment I hit logout, you see the states also reset. The moment I hit logout, I come back to the screen, right? So this is basically how Formik works, but let's just take it a little bit further and make sure we do not sacrifice on like reusability, because you see this function, this logic itself is very similar, right? So, and we definitely can reuse this a little bit. We don't need to constantly be passing a error message everywhere. So I've created uh, a component called input label Formik. Let me just explain what this does and then we'll hook it up, right? So it accepts a few props. Number one, it accepts handle blur, handle change. Name Formik is basically the name. I'm just calling it name Formik, so it's a little bit more descriptive. Then we have the value. We also have a label now. We have placeholder, and we also have a is password boolean, which will render out the password input, right? So let's just see what's happening. There's a bunch of styles here. We have an error message, and you see it's taking the same name. And then if it's not password, then we have the input that's showing. We have like it's basically the same thing we had outside. And if it's a password, it will show this, right? So let's quickly add that in. So we'll save a lot of space here. So let's go ahead and let's call it input label Formik, right? So let's close this. So we are going to pass the same things here, right? Handle blur, and we're going to pass it handle change. And remember, this is an email, so it has to tie up to the same value, the same key, values dot email, and we're going to be like email. So this is a required field. So let's add an asterisk. Let's go ahead and say enter. Actually, please enter email, and let's hit a save, right? So great. So now it's reduced to only one component. So we can do the same thing over here. So let's go ahead and delete that. Let's copy this down, and we'll have to change this to password. We'll have to change this to password, and this to password as well. And finally, we know this is a password field. So let's just say this password is true. So we're going to see a password input rather than its normal input. So now if we jump back and refresh, nothing should change. Obviously, this should all work out of the box. So let's just say admin, we type out some stuff, we hit login, this still works, and bam, you're done, right? So basically, this is how we in Archimedes at least use Formik. As much as possible, we make things as reusable as possible. Like for example, this function, and I mean this component itself, as well as using Formik itself abstracts a lot of these things, such as your validation, which is key, right? You're literally just passing a singular line over here, and you're not really writing any regex, so we don't really have that complexity anymore. and we also handle initial values and on submit, and all of this happens really clean, right? So this is a good design pattern that your team itself can implement at a maybe at a large scale, because in Archimedes we have a lot of places where forms are used heavily, and we've built this whole system that we have that goes ahead and helps developers itself write good forms fast and clean, right? So they're very easy to debug. And for example, if you want to add another field here, right, let's quickly go ahead and add that. Let's just say full name, right? So it's as easy as adding a initial value. Then let's copy the same thing, because we do not have, let me just put this on top to follow that order, right? So this is also a string, and this is required. And then finally we will actually, we need to add it in the TypeScript types as well. So let's just say this is a string, so we don't have any errors from TypeScript. Then we can just copy this, paste this down, and we can say full name. I think that's the way. Yep, no, I have camel case this full name and full name, and let's just say full name, right? So then there you go. So it's like it's as simple as adding just a few lines, literally copy pasting and just using the correct name, and we should have this. So we can see .com and then password, and then we can hit submit, and there we go. Right, so everything resets. So now you can see, like, this is super easy to add new fields, etc. Like, let me just delete these things. So the fact that you have a really simple solution that cleans the way you write forms, and it doesn't really make it complex, it manages your validation, and it also helps with a lot of utility functions for your submission, your loading state, your errors, etc. So this is a really good approach to forms, at least that's what I feel. And yeah, so this is how we are implementing in Archimedes as well as other projects, etc. So yeah, that's basically my talk so far. I hope that's been helpful. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and let me know.